They called her the woman no man could love and live. In Rimrock Valley, a place carved from rock and rumor, Fiona Tucker was a ghost story told in the daylight. She had hair like a struck match and eyes that held the green of a coming storm. And she had the scars, a roadmap of ruin that twisted down the right side of her face, a story everyone thought they knew how to read. They said a fire, lit by the devil himself, had marked her as his own. They said she was cursed. 3 men had tried to get close to her. 3 men were in the ground. That's not a coincidence, the townsfolk would whisper. That's a pattern. Fiona knew what they said. She heard it in the silence when she entered the general store. She saw it in the way mothers pulled their children close. She felt it in the cold, empty space around her homestead. But today, something was different. Old Miss Holloway, a woman whose bravery was measured in the sacks of flour she delivered, had news. Her eyes, usually clouded with pity, held a strange new light. "There's a new man in town," she'd said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "A drifter. Name of Yanzi Zane." Fiona had just shrugged. Rimrock chewed up drifters and spit them out. "He asked about you, child." That made Fiona pause. Asked what? About the woman on the edge of town, about the legend. Fiona's laugh was a bitter, rusty thing. "And I'm sure you all gave him an earful. The curse, the dead men, the mark of God on my face to warn away the foolish." Miss Holloway had looked away, ashamed. As her wagon rattled down the dirt path, Fiona touched the raised, jagged skin on her cheek. The fire was 3 years gone, but the loneliness burned hotter than any flame. She didn't know it yet, but the man named Yanzi Zane wasn't just another drifter. He wasn't there by chance, and he was about to change everything. Yanzi Zane had a simple rule: a story is just a story until you see the proof. He'd heard 100 tall tales in 100 dusty saloons. He'd seen fear make honest men into liars and liars into legends. The story of Fiona Tucker, however, felt different. In the Rimrock saloon, the fear was thick enough to taste. It wasn't just gossip, it was gospel. "My cousin Jimmy," a miner slurred, "courted her for 2 weeks, found him face down in Corman's Creek. Young Prescott," another added, "brought her a fistful of wildflowers. His own horse trampled him the next day. The very next day." The barkeep polished a glass, his voice low and grim. "The lawman from Denver lasted the longest. A full month. Took a stray bullet in a bank robbery clean over in Laramie. A stray bullet. After a month of calling on her. They crossed themselves when they said her name. They believed it. Every last word. This wasn't superstition. This was terror." Yanzi sipped his whiskey. He'd come to Rimrock for a reason, and it wasn't to chase ghost stories. He was looking for a man who'd vanished without a trace, a man whose last known letter was postmarked from this very town. But the story of Fiona Tucker pulled at him. A woman trapped not by walls but by whispers. He'd spent his life on the move, a ghost in his own right, but he was alone by choice. This woman, she was imprisoned. The next morning he rode out. He didn't ask for directions again. He just followed the invisible line the townsfolk had drawn, the unspoken boundary between their world and hers. He found her homestead nestled in a small valley, a testament to stubborn survival. The cabin was small, the barn leaned a little, but the garden was neat and defiant. And then he saw her. She was splitting wood, the axe rising and falling with a brutal, practiced rhythm. The sun caught her copper hair, and for a second he understood why they called it a devil's halo. He could see the scars, even from a distance. But he also saw a strength that the stories had conveniently left out. He cleared his throat. She spun around, the axe held ready. Her eyes were chips of ice. "Private property," she said. He tipped his hat. "Yanzi Zane, new to these parts." And already lost, she shot back. What do you want, Mr. Zane? Did you come to stare at the monster, or are you just tired of living? He couldn't help but smile. Neither, Miss Tucker. I heard you might need a hand with this place. It was a lie, of course, a simple excuse to get closer, to see the woman behind the legend. Her eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. Who told you that? Just noticed the fence line could use some mending. Barn roof looks like it's seen a few too many winters. He paused. I'm a hard worker, and I don't scare easy. Something flickered in her gaze. Not hope, not yet, but something other than pure contempt. The last man who offered me help is buried on Cemetery Hill. I've danced with death a time or two, Yanzi said, his voice even. It'll have to wait its turn. She studied him for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched out, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of risk against a loneliness so profound he could feel it from 10 paces away. Finally, she lowered the axe. Just an inch. $2 a day, she said, her voice flat. You sleep in the barn. You provide your own food. And the moment you mention curses, devils, or my face, you're gone. Fair enough, he said, settling his hat. I'll be here at dawn. As he rode away, he knew she was watching him. He'd come to Rimrock looking for a missing man, but he'd just stumbled into a mystery far deeper, far darker, and far more dangerous. A mystery with haunting green eyes. The work was a kind of language between them. For weeks, the only sounds were the hammer on wood, the scrape of a shovel, the rhythmic thud of the axe. Yanzi arrived with the sun and left with it. He mended her fences. He patched her roof. He dug irrigation ditches until his back ached. Fiona worked alongside him sometimes, her movements efficient and strong. She was a woman who had learned to rely on no one but herself. The silence between them was a wall she had built brick by brick, but walls have cracks. My father taught me to use an axe, she said one afternoon, out of the blue. They were splitting logs, the air smelling of pine and sweat. He said a woman should know how to fend for herself, said the men in her life might prove unreliable. There was a story there, Yanzi knew it, but he didn't push. Wise man, was all he said. He was, she agreed, her voice softening for a moment. Until he wasn't. And just like that, the wall was back up. He learned about her in these small pieces. The bay mare, Rosie, was the last thing she had of her mother. The well-tended garden was grown from seeds her mother had brought from back east. Her world was small, built from the remnants of a life that had been snatched away. He was mending a gate when he saw the locket. It was small and silver, and she wore it on a chain around her neck. He'd seen her touch it 100 times, a nervous, unconscious gesture. That's a beautiful locket, he said, his voice casual. Her hand flew to her throat, covering it. Her eyes went hard. It was my mother's. I didn't mean to pry. Everyone pries in Rimrock, she said, turning away. But not before he saw the flash of pain in her eyes. It was more than just grief. It was fear. That night in the saloon, the whispers found him again. Harkins, a logger with a belly full of whiskey and a heart full of hate, cornered him. She got her hooks in you yet, cowboy, he sneered. Or is the curse just taking its time? Yancy ignored him. He was tired of the stories. You know how she got them scars? Harkins leaned in, his breath sour. Set the fire herself, with her own father locked inside. He found out she was a witch, see, was gonna get the preacher. She burned him alive to shut him up. Yancey's hand tightened on his whiskey glass. He'd heard Fiona's words. He said the men in her life might prove unreliable. That's a hell of a story, Harkins, Yancey said, his voice dangerously quiet. It's God's truth, the logger insisted. And you're next on her list. Later, Lying in his boarding house bed, the pieces clicked together in a way that made his blood run cold. He hadn't come to Rimrock just to find a missing man. The man he was looking for was James Anderson, the first of Fiona Tucker's dead suitors, the man who had supposedly drowned in Corman's Creek. Yancey wasn't a drifter. He was a Pinkerton agent hired by Anderson's wealthy family in Chicago to find out what had happened to their son. They didn't believe the stories of an accidental drowning, and now neither did he. He was supposed to be investigating a missing person, but he was starting to realize he might be investigating a murder, and he was falling for the prime suspect. The next day, the air on the homestead was thick with unspoken things. Yancey found Fiona on the barn roof, hammering shingles with a fury that seemed to go beyond the task at hand. He climbed the ladder, his movements slow and deliberate. "The town's still talking," he said, his voice even. Her hammer paused. "They never stop. They're saying you killed your father, that you set the fire." The hammer came down hard, splitting a shingle clean in two. She sat back on her heels, her knuckles white. He could see the tremor in her hands. "And you?" she asked, her voice tight. "You want to know if it's true. I want to know your version." She stared at him, her green eyes searching his face. He'd expected anger, defiance. He saw exhaustion, a soul-deep weariness that went far beyond her years. "My father was a good man," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Before my mother died, the grief, it broke something inside him. He started drinking. Not just whiskey. He drank the darkness." She traced the scars on her cheek, a familiar, painful gesture. "He started seeing things, hearing things. He'd shout at shadows. He said the house was filled with demons." Her gaze drifted to the horizon. "That night, he lit lanterns in every room. To drive out the evil," he said. "The whole cabin was glowing. I tried to stop him. He pushed me away, said I was one of them." She swallowed hard. "The fire started in their bedroom. I dragged him out. But I went back in for her things, her hairbrush, her Bible. A roof beam fell. That's this." She gestured to her face. "By the time I got out, he was gone, wandered off into the night, raving. They found him 3 days later, in the creek." Her eyes finally met his, blazing with a defiant pain. "I didn't kill him, Mr. Zane. The town just found it easier to believe I was a monster than to believe a good man could be eaten alive by his own sorrow." He believed her. Every word of it rang with the terrible clarity of truth. But it didn't solve his problem. It only made it worse. "And the others?" he asked, his voice gentle. "James Anderson?" A shadow passed over her face. "Jimmy. He was sweet, before the fire. He said the scars didn't matter. He drowned, fishing, the same creek." "William Prescott. He brought me flowers. Once. A week later he was trampled in a cattle drive. A freak accident." "And Marshall Davis?" Her voice faltered. "He was kind. He stood up for me. He was killed during a bank robbery. They said it was just bad luck. 3 men, 3 tragedies, all conveniently explained away." But Yancey was a man who dealt in facts, not luck. James Anderson wasn't a simple fisherman. He was a card sharp and a cheat who owed money to dangerous men all over the territory. William Prescott wasn't just a ranch hand. He had a reputation for rebranding cattle that didn't belong to him. And Marshall Davis? His record wasn't as clean as the tin star on his chest suggested. Fiona saw them as tragedies, as proof of her curse. Yancey was starting to see them as something else entirely, a pattern of justice. He looked at this woman with her scarred face and haunted eyes, a woman who could swing an axe with deadly precision, a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of society. He had to consider a terrifying possibility. What if the curse was real, but it wasn't supernatural? What if Fiona Tucker wasn't a victim of the legend? What if she was the legend? The days grew shorter. The air grew crisp with the promise of autumn. The work on the homestead was a rhythm, a routine, but underneath it, a dangerous current was flowing. Yanzi was no longer just a handyman. He was an investigator, watching, listening, trying to piece together a puzzle where every piece was stained with blood. He searched the burned-out foundation of the old cabin while Fiona was away, picking through the charred remnants of her past. He found nothing, just ash and ghosts. He rode out to Corman's Creek, to the spot where James Anderson had supposedly drowned. It was a shallow, placid stream. A man would have to work hard to drown in it, unless he had help. He felt like he was walking a razor's edge. Every conversation with Fiona was a test. He'd ask about her father, about the men who died, watching for a slip, a flicker of something other than grief in her eyes. He found nothing, only a deep, abiding sadness. And yet, the doubt lingered. One evening they sat on her porch as the sun bled across the sky. The comfortable silence they had built was gone, replaced by a tension that crackled between them. "You never talk about yourself," she said suddenly. "Where did you come from, Yanzi?" "All over," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "No family to speak of." "So you're untethered," she said, her voice soft. Less so these days, he thought, and the realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just investigating her anymore. He cared about her. He was starting to believe that a life with her, here in this forgotten valley, was a life he wanted. And that scared him more than any curse. He knew he had to push. He had to know the truth, no matter how ugly. A few days later, he found his chance. He was helping her clear out a corner of the barn, a space cluttered with old tools and forgotten junk. Tucked away in a dusty crate was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. His heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at Fiona, who was on the other side of the barn, her back to him. His hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It was her mother's. He flipped through the pages, scanning entries about weather, crops, the simple joys and sorrows of a homesteader's life. Then he found it. An entry dated just a few weeks before the fire. "My husband's mind is slipping away. The darkness that took his brother is now coming for him. He grows paranoid, violent. Last night he struck Fiona. He sees enemies in every shadow. I fear for my daughter. I fear what he might do. I have written to my sister in St. Louis, begging her to send for Fiona. She cannot stay here. He is not the man I married anymore. He is a danger to her." Yansi's blood ran cold, the darkness that took his brother. Her father wasn't just a drunk. It was something more, something hereditary. And he'd been violent. But that wasn't the most chilling part. Tucked into the back of the diary was a loose sheet of paper. The handwriting was different. It was Fiona's. It was a list of names. James Anderson, William Prescott, Marshall Davis. And next to each name a single, damning word. Guilty. The barn seemed to shrink around him. The air grew thin. He looked over at Fiona, this woman he was beginning to love, and saw a stranger. A judge, a jury, an executioner. The story she told him was a lie. A carefully constructed performance of a grieving victim. The men hadn't been tragic accidents. They had been sentences, carried out. He slid the diary back into the crate, his mind reeling. He had come to Rimrock to find a killer. He had found one, and he was living in her barn. That night, sleep was a stranger. Yanzi lay in his boarding house room. The image of that list burned into his mind. Guilty. The word echoed, a death knell. He was a Pinkerton. His duty was clear. He had the evidence. Not enough for a conviction, maybe, but enough to bring the law down on her. Enough to see her hang. But his heart was at war with his duty. He thought of her hands calloused from work. He thought of her rare, breathtaking smiles. He thought of the profound loneliness in her eyes. He remembered her face when she talked about her father. The town just found it easier to believe I was a monster. Was that what he was doing? Believing she was a monster because the evidence pointed that way? The next day was Sunday. He made a decision. He wasn't going to the homestead. He was going to church. He needed to see the faces of this town. He needed to understand the world that had created Fiona Tucker. He sat in the back pew, a stranger among them. He watched as Reverend Powell spoke of sin and redemption. He watched Hawkins, the belligerent logger, sit with his family, looking for all the world like a pillar of the community. He saw Miss Holloway, her face etched with a quiet kindness. These people had judged Fiona. They had convicted her without a trial, sentenced her to a life of isolation. And she had fought back. In the only way she knew how. After the service, he sought out the town doctor, a man named Elias Croft. He was old, with watery eyes and hands that shook, but his mind was still sharp. Yanzi bought him a drink at the saloon, away from prying ears. "I'm curious about old man Tucker," Yanzi began, keeping his voice casual. "Before he died." The doctor sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "A tragedy. A good man, swallowed by grief. His brother went the same way, you know, years ago. Put a gun in his mouth. A darkness ran in that family's blood." This confirmed the diary entry, but Yanzi needed more. "And the men who died?" Yanzi pressed gently. "James Anderson, for instance. I heard he drowned." Dr. Croft snorted. "Drowned? Yes. That's the official story. Unofficially, the boy had 2 broken arms and a cracked skull when they pulled him from that creek. Not the kind of injuries you get from slipping on a rock." Yancey's heart hammered against his ribs. "What about Prescott?" "Trampled by his own horse," the doctor said, lowering his voice. "Funny thing, though. The horse that supposedly trampled him, it had a fresh brand on its flank. A brand belonging to the Miller Ranch, 50 miles south. The horse was stolen." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more terrifying than he could have imagined. "And Marshall Davis?" The doctor leaned in close. "The bank robbery in Laramie was real, but the bullet that killed Davis didn't come from the robbers' guns. The sheriff up there, a friend of mine, told me it was a shot from a buffalo rifle, fired from a rooftop half a mile away, a professional hit. Broken arms, a stolen horse, an assassination. These weren't the acts of a lone, vengeful woman. This was something else, something organized, something with resources. Fiona wasn't a lone executioner, but if she wasn't the one carrying out the sentences, who was? And why did they all lead back to her? The wind howled that night, rattling the windows of Yanzi's small room. It sounded like a woman weeping or laughing. He couldn't tell which. His mind was a maelstrom. Fiona wasn't the killer. The evidence from the doctor was clear. The deaths were too complex, too professional. A woman living alone on a homestead didn't have the means to arrange an assassination from a rooftop in Laramie. But the list was real. Guilty. She was involved. She had to be. Was she the bait? A lure for wicked men? A honey trap with a deadly sting? Was she working with someone? A partner in justice? Or in crime? He had to get back to that diary. He had to know more about this darkness that ran in her family, this thing that had taken her uncle and her father. He rode out to the homestead before dawn, the sky a bruised purple. He found her in the garden, a silhouette against the rising sun, tending her plants as if the world wasn't a place of secrets and death. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "Couldn't sleep," he said, the words true enough. He made an excuse about needing a tool from the barn and slipped inside. The air was cool and smelled of hay and leather. He went straight to the crate. The diary was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Had she seen him with it? Did she know he was onto her? He searched the crate, then the shelves around it, his movements growing more frantic. It was gone. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. He spun around. Fiona stood in the doorway, blocking the morning light. In her hands, she held her father's Winchester rifle. It was aimed directly at his heart. "Looking for this?" she asked, her voice as cold as a grave. She held up the small, leather-bound diary. The game was over. "Fiona," he started, holding his hands up slowly. "Let's talk about this." "I think we're done talking," she said. Her eyes were hard, the soft, grieving woman he'd come to know, completely gone. In her place was a stranger, forged in fire and shadow. "You're a Pinkerton." It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" he asked, his mind racing. "The questions you asked, the way you looked at me. I wasn't sure until I saw you with my mother's diary. You're here about James Anderson, aren't you?" "His family hired me," he admitted. "They wanted to know what happened to him." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "What happened to him is he got what he deserved. They all did." So the list was real. She had judged them. "Why, Fiona? Why you?" "Because no one else would," she snapped, the rifle unwavering. "Anderson was a cheat and a brute. Prescott was a thief who would have ruined his neighbors. Davis was a lawman on the take, protecting criminals for a price. They were a rot in this valley, and they all saw me as an easy target, a broken, scarred woman they could use and discard." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "They thought my scars made me weak. They didn't realize the fire burns the weakness away. It leaves only what's hard, what's strong enough to survive." "But you didn't kill them," he said, stating it as a fact. "The doctor told me how they died. It wasn't you." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The rifle barrel dipped, just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" "Anderson's broken arms, Prescott's stolen horse, Davis's assassination. That wasn't your work." He took a careful step forward. "You judged them, didn't you? You wrote their names down. But someone else was your executioner. Who is it, Fiona? Who are you protecting?" She stared at him, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. It was the truth. She didn't know. She truly believed her curse was real, a dark force that answered her silent prayers for justice. She thought she was a witch, commanding the powers of death. But she wasn't. She was a pawn. A sudden noise from outside shattered the tension. A horse whinnied in panic. A man shouted, his voice thick with drunken rage. "Zane, we know you're in there. Come on out, or we're coming in." It was Harkins, and he wasn't alone. The town, it seemed, had finally decided to deal with the curse themselves. Fiona's head snapped toward the sound, her momentary confusion replaced by a familiar, hunted look. "They've come for me." "They've come for both of us," Yanzi corrected, his eyes on the barn door. He could see the shifting shadows of at least half a dozen men. Some carried rifles, others carried torches. This wasn't a warning. It was a lynching. "Who is helping you, Fiona?" he demanded again, his voice urgent. "Whoever it is, they've been watching you. They've been protecting you. They might be our only way out of this." She shook her head, her face pale. "No one. There's no one." "Think," he pressed. "Your father." The diary said he was violent, that his mind was slipping. It said his brother killed himself. What if he didn't die in that creek? What if he's still out there? Her eyes widened in disbelief. "My father is dead." "Is he?" Yancey countered. "A man who knows these hills, a man who's already lost his mind to grief and paranoia. What wouldn't he do to protect the only thing he has left?" A crash from the front of the cabin sent a shower of glass tinkling to the floor. The mob was getting impatient. Fiona looked from the barn door to Yancey, her world tilting on its axis. The curse that had defined her life, the guilt she had secretly carried, thinking her dark thoughts had willed these men to their deaths. What if it was all a lie? What if her protector was the very man she thought she had lost? Before she could answer, a voice boomed from the darkness of the barn's hayloft. A voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. "Get away from my daughter!" The voice was rough, scarred by time and solitude, but it was unmistakable. Yanzi and Fiona both looked up into the shadows of the hayloft. A figure emerged, stepping into a sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the roof. He was gaunt, his hair and beard wild and matted. His eyes burned with a mad, protective fire. He held a large caliber buffalo rifle with an unnerving stillness. It was Fiona's father. He wasn't a ghost. He was real. "Father," Fiona whispered, the Winchester sagging in her hands. "I told you I'd always look after you, Pumpkin," he rasped. He ignored Yanzi completely, his crazed eyes fixed on his daughter. "These men, they're like all the others. Vultures. They see your pain and think it's a weakness they can exploit. I won't let them." It all crashed down on Yanzi with sickening clarity. The father hadn't drowned. He'd vanished into the wilderness, his broken mind twisting his paternal love into a murderous obsession. He'd been watching, always watching. When James Anderson got too close, he'd been waiting by the creek. When Prescott made his move, he'd engineered the stampede. And when Marshall Davis threatened to uncover the truth, he'd traveled all the way to Laramie. Fiona wasn't the judge. She was the trigger. Her fear, her anger, her silent wishes for justice. Her father had heard them all, and he had answered. "You killed them," Yanzi said, the words heavy in the air. The old man's eyes finally shifted to him. They were chillingly sane. "I protected my own, just like any good father would. She is all I have left of her mother. I will not see her hurt." Outside, Harkins roared again. "We're burning it down. We'll smoke the witch out." The smell of smoke began to drift into the barn. They'd set the cabin alight. Fiona's father cocked the massive rifle. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. "You," he said, nodding at Yanzi. "Pinkerton, I've known who you were since the day you arrived. You love her. I can see it. A man like you would die for her." "I would," Yanzi said without hesitation. "Good," the old man said, a grim smile twisting his lips. He looked back at Fiona, and for a fleeting moment, the madness in his eyes cleared, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking love. "The legend has to end tonight. The curse needs one last victim." He didn't wait for a reply. He moved with a speed that defied his haggard appearance, shoving Yanzi and Fiona toward a concealed door at the back of the barn. "There's a tunnel. Leads to the creek bed. Go. Now." "I'm not leaving you," Fiona cried, reaching for him. "You are," he said, his voice firm. He pushed the rifle into Yanzi's hands. "Keep her safe. That's your job now." He kissed Fiona's forehead, a rough, tender gesture. "I love you, Pumpkin." And then he turned and walked toward the main barn doors, toward the shouting and the firelight. He threw the doors open, silhouetted against the growing blaze of the cabin. "You want the devil that haunts this valley?" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the property. "Here I am." He raised a pistol and fired a shot into the air. The mob, startled and enraged, returned fire. A dozen rifles cracked in unison. Fiona screamed as her father's body was thrown backward, falling into the hay. Yanzi didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her through the hidden door into the damp, dark earth of the tunnel. Behind them, they could hear the roar as the barn began to catch fire, the flames consuming the man who had been both Fiona's curse and her savior. They stumbled out of the tunnel into the cool night air, the creek gurgling beside them. The sky above the homestead was a hellish orange. The gunshots had stopped. The shouting had turned to stunned silence. Harkins and the others had their victim. They had killed the monster of Rimrock Valley. The curse was broken. Fiona collapsed by the creek, racking sobs tearing through her. Yanzi knelt beside her, his hand on her back. He had found his killer. He had uncovered the truth. And now the truth was a fire devouring everything she had ever known. Justice had been served. But it felt like the cruelest joke in the world. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The cabin was a pile of smoldering embers. The barn was a blackened skeleton. And the body of Fiona's father had been taken into town, laid out as a trophy. Proof that the town's fear had been justified, even if they'd aimed it at the wrong person. Harkins was hailed as a hero, the man who had finally ended the Rimrock curse. Yanzi and Fiona watched the dawn from the shelter of the woods. The truth was their burden now, a secret they would have to carry forever. To the world, Fiona's father was a madman who had finally snapped. No one would ever know he was also the ghost who had dispensed a brutal, bloody justice in his daughter's name. "What do we do now?" Fiona asked, her voice hollow. Yanzi looked at the smoking ruins of her home, then at her face, illuminated by the soft morning light. Her scars seemed less like marks of ruin and more like medals of survival. He thought of the Pinkerton agency. He thought of the report he was supposed to file, the neat and tidy conclusion to the case of James Anderson. He thought of his duty. And then he threw it all away. "We start over," he said. He took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was strong. "The legend is dead. The whispers will stop. They have their monster. They'll leave you alone now." "But they'll never know the truth," she whispered. "They'll never know what he did. For me." "We know," Yanzi said softly. "And that's enough." In the weeks that followed, a strange peace settled over Rimrock Valley. With the curse officially broken, the fear that had poisoned the town for so long began to fade. Harkins's heroism was short-lived. When the initial adrenaline wore off, people started to remember that he had led an armed, drunken mob to burn down a woman's home. Shame began to curdle their relief. Yanzi filed his report. James Anderson, it concluded, fell afoul of a local madman, Elias Tucker, who had been living feral in the hills and was responsible for a string of violent acts. Tucker was killed while resisting lawful citizen arrest. Case closed. It was a lie, but it was a lie that protected the living and buried the dead. He never worked for the Pinkertons again. He and Fiona rebuilt. With help from a repentant Miss Holloway and a few others, they raised a new cabin from the ashes. They cleared the land. They planted new seeds. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was a foundation, solid and real, built not on legends and lies, but on shared loss and a stubborn, defiant hope. The whispers about Fiona Tucker died out, replaced by a quiet respect for the woman who had endured the fire and come out the other side. They never spoke of her father or of the list in the diary. They didn't have to. The truth lived in the space between them, a silent understanding of the terrible, beautiful, and complicated nature of love and protection. One spring afternoon, a year later, they stood on their porch watching the sun set over the valley. The world was green and gold and full of promise. Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder. The scars on her face were just a part of her now, no more or less important than the green of her eyes or the copper of her hair. "He would have liked you," she said quietly. Yanzi put his arm around her. "I think, in his own way, he did. He gave you to me." They had found their peace not by outrunning the ghosts of the past, but by learning to live with them. The only curse in Rimrock Valley had been fear. The only monster had been misunderstanding. And the greatest legend of all was the simple, powerful truth that love, in the end, could rebuild a life from the ashes. This story is a reminder that the truth is often more complicated and heartbreaking than the stories we tell ourselves. It's about how fear can twist good people into a mob, and how a father's love, twisted by grief, can become something monstrous. If you were moved by Fiona and Yancey's journey, and you want to hear more stories that dig beneath the surface of the legends we think we know, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.